The summer of 1878 brought a relentless heat to the Texas plains, the kind that made the horizon shimmer like a mirage and drove men to seek shelter during the hottest hours of the day. James Montgomery wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting at the distant figures approaching his ranch. At 52, his weathered face told the story of a life lived hard on the frontier. The former cavalry officer had seen his share of battles, both in the war and in the 20 years since he'd claimed this patch of earth as his own. His calloused hands gripped the porch railing as the riders drew closer, their silhouettes taking form against the golden afternoon light. Montgomery's ranch, Ironwood, sat like an island in a sea of prairie grass, a testament to his stubborn refusal to surrender to the harsh realities of Texas life. The main house, built of sturdy oak and local stone, stood as a fortress against both the elements and the various threats that came with frontier living. Behind it, a collection of outbuildings, corrals, and a small bunkhouse completed the homestead he'd carved out of this unforgiving land. I'd like to kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'd love to know which city you're watching from. Now, back to our story of the Lone Rancher and the Comanche sisters. The two riders approached with a confidence that immediately caught Montgomery's attention. They rode with the ease of those born to the saddle, their postures betraying a familiarity with the land that few possessed. As they came into clearer view, Montgomery's eyes narrowed in surprise. Two women, their long black hair flowing beneath wide-brimmed hats, dressed in a curious blend of traditional Comanche attire and frontier clothing. Their faces, high-cheeked and proud, held an unmistakable resemblance to each other. Sisters, he guessed, though one appeared slightly older than the other. The elder's face was set in a determined expression, while the younger's eyes darted around, taking in every detail of the ranch with undisguised curiosity. Montgomery's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip, a habit formed through decades of caution. "Thomas," he called to his foreman, without taking his eyes off the approaching visitors. "We've got company." Thomas Wilkins, a lean man in his 30s, with a perpetual shadow of a beard, emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes followed Montgomery's gaze to the approaching riders. "Comanche women," he observed quietly, surprise evident in his voice. "Riding alone." It was indeed an unusual sight in these parts, especially in these times when relations between settlers and the native tribes remained tense at best. Most Comanche had been forced onto reservations years ago, following the Red River War. Those who remained free typically avoided prolonged contact with white settlements. Yet here were two Comanche women riding openly toward a white man's ranch as if they belonged there. Montgomery descended the porch steps, standing tall as the women reined in their horses about 20 feet away. The dust from their arrival swirled around their mounts, creating a momentary haze in the afternoon sun. "State your business," Montgomery called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. The elder sister dismounted with fluid grace, her movements suggesting the strength of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. She wore a leather vest over a simple cotton shirt, buckskin pants, and boots that had seen many miles. A knife was visibly sheathed at her belt, but Montgomery noted she carried no firearm that he could see. The younger sister remained mounted, her hands loosely holding the reins, ready to bolt if necessary. "My name is Numanu Titsu," the woman said in surprisingly good English, though her accent was distinctive. "This is my sister, Wahatu. We've come about the land north of the creek." Her directness caught Montgomery off guard, though he didn't let it show on his face. The land she mentioned was a recent acquisition of his, a parcel he'd purchased from a neighbor who'd decided to move back east after losing his wife to fever. "That land belongs to me," Montgomery stated flatly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman before him. "Bought and paid for, with papers to prove it." Titsu's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes. A mixture of anger and resolve that Montgomery had seen before in those preparing for confrontation. "That land has belonged to our family for generations," she replied, her voice steady despite the underlying tension. "Long before any paper said otherwise. We were born in the caves by the northern ridge. Our grandmother's bones rest beneath the old oak at the bend in the creek. Your papers mean nothing to the land itself." Thomas shifted uneasily beside Montgomery, his hand hovering near his own sidearm. The air between the rancher and the Comanche woman seemed to crackle with unspoken challenge. Behind Titsu, her sister Wahatu watched the exchange with keen interest, her youthful face a complex mixture of wariness and defiance. Montgomery had dealt with land disputes before. In the chaotic years following the war, claim jumpers and opportunists had been common enough. But there was something different about this confrontation, something that stirred an old feeling in his gut. These women weren't claiming the land based on papers or government grants. Their claim went deeper, rooted in a connection to the land that predated all the ranches, towns, and territories that white men had drawn up on their maps. "The government settled things with the Comanche years ago," he said finally, falling back on the official position. "The treaties are clear. Your people have their designated lands now." Titsu's lip curled slightly at this. "We are not our people. We are ourselves. And we have not signed your papers or accepted your boundaries." Her hand gestured to the horizon. "This is Numanu land. It always has been. The creek, the ridge, the hunting grounds. They know us. They do not know you." The standoff continued as the sun inched lower in the western sky, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Montgomery found himself at an unusual loss. Typically, disputes like this would end with threats, sometimes violence, occasionally the involvement of the local law. But something about these sisters, their dignity, their certainty, their sheer audacity in riding up to his ranch alone, gave him pause. "What exactly do you want?" he asked finally, deciding to get to the heart of the matter. Titsu glanced back at her sister, a silent communication passing between them before she turned back to Montgomery. "We want to continue to live on the land as we always have. The caves, the creek, the hunting grounds. We ask nothing of you except to recognize our right to remain." Montgomery frowned. "And if I refuse?" Titsu's gaze didn't waver. "Then you will find the land itself will refuse you. The horses will break their fences. The cattle will scatter. The water will turn against you. Some things cannot be owned, Montgomery. They can only be understood." The boldness of her statement, using his name though he hadn't offered it, and the implied threat sent a ripple of anger through Montgomery. He'd built this ranch from nothing, through sheer determination and hard work. He'd buried a wife and an infant son in the small plot behind the house. He defended his claim against rustlers, drought, and economic downturns. He wasn't about to be intimidated by cryptic threats from anyone, regardless of their heritage. "I don't take kindly to threats, Miss Titsu," he said, his voice hardening. That land is mine by law. Whatever your family once claimed there is in the past now." He expected anger in return, perhaps more threats or demands. Instead, Titsasu simply nodded, as if his response confirmed something she already knew. "We will return tomorrow," she said simply, "when you have had time to consider what it means to truly claim a piece of this earth." With that, she remounted her horse with the same fluid grace with which she dismounted. The sisters exchanged another look between them before turning their horses and riding away, leaving Montgomery and Thomas standing in a cloud of dust and confusion. "What do you make of that?" Thomas asked, as they watched the women disappear into the distance. Montgomery's jaw was set in a hard line, his eyes fixed on the horizon long after the riders had vanished from sight. "I've seen all manner of folk trying to claim what isn't theirs," he said finally. "But those two—" He shook his head, unable to articulate exactly what had unsettled him about the encounter. "Post extra guards tonight, and send word to Sheriff Blackwood in town. I want him to know we might have trouble brewing." As Thomas headed off to carry out his instructions, Montgomery remained on the porch, his eyes drawn to the northern section of his property, to the ridge and creek the women had spoken of. Something in their words had stirred a memory, a story told to him years ago by an old trapper about the land and its history, about caves that had sheltered generations of Comanche, about hunting grounds considered sacred. He dismissed it at the time as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too many years alone in the wilderness. Now, he wondered if there might have been more truth to those tales than he'd been willing to acknowledge. That night, an unusual restlessness plagued Ironwood Ranch. The horses in the corral nickered and paced, refusing to settle, despite the efforts of the ranch hands. The cattle in the north pasture huddled together, ignoring the abundant grass that normally would have kept them grazing contentedly. Even the dogs seemed on edge, whining at shadows and barking at nothing. Montgomery sat on his porch long into the night, a glass of whiskey in hand and his Winchester rifle across his lap. The moon rose full and bright, illuminating the landscape in a pale, ghostly light that transformed the familiar into something strange and uncertain. In the distance, beyond the boundaries of his ranch, Montgomery thought he could hear the faint rhythm of drums, though when he strained to listen more carefully, the sound seemed to dissolve into the natural chorus of night insects and wind through the prairie grass. Whether real or imagined, the sound stirred something primal in him, a recognition of a world that existed alongside but separate from the one he'd built for himself. Morning broke with an eerie calm across Ironwood Ranch. Montgomery rose before dawn, as was his habit, to find Thomas already up and looking troubled. "Two of the fence lines along the north boundary are down," the foreman reported without preamble, "and a dozen head of cattle have wandered off into the hills." Montgomery's expression darkened. "Coincidence or mischief?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Thomas shrugged. "No signs of tampering that I could find. Could have been coyotes spooked the herd, maybe a mountain lion. Johnson and Parker are already out tracking them." Montgomery nodded, his mind turning over the possibilities. Cattle occasionally broke through fencing, especially during storms or if predators were about. But given yesterday's confrontation, he couldn't help but connect the incidents. "Let's ride out to the North Ridge," he decided. "I want to see these caves the women spoke of for myself." The ride to the northern boundary of Montgomery's property took the better part of an hour. The land changed character as they traveled, transitioning from the relatively flat grazing lands near the ranch house to more rugged terrain marked by rocky outcroppings and stands of juniper and mesquite. The creek the Comanche sisters had mentioned cut through the landscape, a silver ribbon that had carved its way through the earth over countless centuries. Even in the heat of summer, it flowed clear and steady, fed by underground springs that made this section of land particularly valuable in the often dry Texas hill country. Montgomery and Thomas followed the creek upstream, their horses picking their way carefully along the rocky banks. As they rounded a bend, the old oak tree came into view, massive and ancient, its sprawling branches creating a rare patch of deep shade. Montgomery reined in his horse, studying the tree and the ground beneath it with newfound interest. Nothing marked the spot as a burial ground, at least not to his untrained eye. But something about the place, a certain stillness perhaps, or the way the light filtered through the leaves, gave it an undeniable sense of significance. "Over there," Thomas said, pointing to a rocky hillside about a quarter-mile beyond the oak. "That must be the caves they mentioned." Montgomery nodded, urging his horse forward. As they approached, the mouth of a cave became visible, a dark opening in the limestone cliff face, partially obscured by scrub growth. From a distance, it would be easy to miss, blending into the shadows of the hillside. Up close, however, it was clearly a significant feature, large enough for a man to enter standing upright, with signs that it extended deep into the earth. Montgomery dismounted, tying his horse to a small juniper. "Stay here with the horses," he instructed Thomas. "I want to take a look inside." The foreman looked uneasy. "You sure that's wise, boss? No telling what might be in there." Montgomery checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded and ready. "I need to know what I'm dealing with," he said simply, before turning toward the cave entrance. The air inside the cave was noticeably cooler, a welcome relief from the growing heat of the day. Montgomery paused just inside the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimness. As details emerged from the darkness, he found himself standing in a natural chamber about 20 feet across, with a ceiling high enough that he didn't need to stoop. The floor was surprisingly level, swept clean of debris. This was no wild animal's den, but a place that had been used by humans, and recently. Along one wall, he could make out faint markings, pictographs in red and black ochre depicting human figures, animals, and more abstract symbols. Some looked ancient, others more recent. In one corner, a small circle of stones marked a fire pit, the ashes cold but not old. Small niches in the walls held various items, bundles of dried herbs, small carved figures, a child's moccasin. It was clearly a place of significance, used for more than mere shelter. As Montgomery moved deeper into the cave, the sound of dripping water led him to a small underground spring that bubbled up from the rock itself, collecting in a natural basin before disappearing again into the earth. The water looked crystal clear and pure, a rare and valuable resource in this landscape. Montgomery stood in silence, taking in the cave and its contents. He was no stranger to the history of the land he'd claimed. He knew that others had lived here before him, had hunted these hills and drank from these springs. But seeing this place, this tangible connection to a past that continued to exist in the present through women like Titsu and Wahatu, made that knowledge immediate and undeniable in a way it hadn't been before. He reached out to touch one of the pictographs, his fingers hovering just above the surface of the rock. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a voice said from the cave entrance. Montgomery spun around, his hand dropping to his revolver. Silhouetted against the daylight stood Titsu, her form casting a long shadow into the cave. Some things are not for your hands to touch, she continued, stepping into the chamber. In the dim light, her features seemed to shift between youth and age, as if the cave itself altered her appearance. Or your ownership. Montgomery kept his hand near his weapon, but didn't draw it. "You've been living here," he said. It wasn't a question. Tetsu moved further into the cave with the comfort of someone returning home. "Not always. We follow the seasons, as our people have always done. But yes, this place has sheltered my family for more generations than your kind has walked these lands." She gestured to the pictographs. "My great-grandmother drew this hunting scene when she was a girl. My grandmother added these symbols when she became a medicine woman. My mother placed her handprint here when she learned she carried me in her womb." Her voice held no challenge now, only a quiet pride and certainty. "And someday, perhaps my own daughter will add her mark to this wall." Montgomery found himself without an immediate response. The personal history Tetsu described transformed the cave from an interesting historical site to something more intimate and ongoing, a living record of a family's connection to the land. "The law doesn't recognize such claims," he said finally, falling back on the structures that had shaped his understanding of property and ownership. Tetsu's expression didn't change. "The law is a story your people tell yourselves," she replied. "A new story, written on paper that will yellow and crumble long before these marks fade from the stone. The land does not read your papers or recognize your boundaries." She moved to the spring, cupping her hands to drink from the clear water. "This spring has never run dry, not even in the worst droughts. It nourishes the creek that waters your cattle. The caves shelter animals that keep the balance of life in these hills. The old oak guards the spirits of my ancestors, who watch over all who pass beneath its branches." She straightened, looking directly at Montgomery. "These things were here before you. They will remain after you are gone. The question is not whether you own this land, but whether you understand what it means to be its caretaker." Montgomery felt a flicker of irritation at her presumption, at the implication that his years of hard work meant nothing compared to ancient stories and markings on a cave wall. But another part of him, the part that had learned to read the land during his long years on the frontier, recognized the truth in her words. This spring, this cave, the old oak by the creek, they were indeed special places, with a significance that transcended the boundaries drawn on maps and deeds. "What would you have me do?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Abandon my claim? Turn over my ranch to you and your sister?" Tetsu shook her head. "We do not want your ranch or your cattle. We want only what has always been ours, the right to live in harmony with these sacred places, to continue the traditions of our family. The caves, the spring, the old oak, and the hunting grounds beyond the ridge. A small portion of what you now claim as yours." Outside the cave, a sudden commotion broke the stillness. Voices raised in alarm, the sound of horses neighing in distress. Montgomery pushed past Tetsu to the cave entrance, blinking in the sudden brightness. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. Thomas was on the ground, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. Several of Montgomery's ranch hands had arrived, their horses skittish and wild-eyed. And between them stood Wahatu, the younger sister, a rifle in her hands pointed squarely at the ranch hands. Her face was a mask of fierce determination, her posture suggesting she was more than ready to use the weapon if provoked. "Wahatu!" Tetsu called out sharply from behind Montgomery, her voice carrying a clear command. The younger woman's eyes flicked to her sister, but the rifle didn't waver. One of the ranch hands, a hot-headed young man named Harlan, had his own weapon drawn. The standoff teetered on the edge of violence, a single wrong move away from bloodshed. "Lower your weapons," Montgomery ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. "All of you." Harlan looked at him in disbelief. "But boss, she shot Thomas, came out of nowhere and—" "I said lower your weapons," Montgomery repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Slowly, reluctantly, Harlan lowered his pistol. The other hands followed suit. Montgomery turned to Wahatu, who still held her rifle steady. "Your sister and I were talking. There was no need for this." Wahatu's eyes narrowed. "They came with ropes and chains," she said in accented but clear English, "to take us away, like they took our cousin last summer." Montgomery looked to Thomas, who was being helped to his feet by one of the other hands. "Is this true?" Thomas winced, clutching his arm, where a bullet had grazed him. "We thought she was trespassing, boss. Sheriff Blackwood said if we found them, we should bring them in. Said there's been complaints about Indians stealing from farms north of here." Montgomery's jaw tightened. He'd sent word to Sheriff Blackwood about potential trouble, yes, but he hadn't authorized any attempt to capture the Comanche women. The sheriff had apparently taken it upon himself to issue such orders, likely seeing an opportunity to resolve what he would consider an Indian problem in his jurisdiction. "Wahatu," Titsu said calmly in Comanche, though her eyes betrayed her concern. "Lower the rifle. This man is listening. There is another way." For a long moment, it seemed the younger sister might refuse. But then, gradually, she lowered the weapon, though she kept it ready in her hands. The tension in the clearing eased slightly, though distrust still hung heavy in the air. Montgomery turned to his men. "Take Thomas back to the ranch and have his arms seen to. Tell Sheriff Blackwood I'll speak with him myself about this matter." He fixed Harlan with a stern look. "And no one takes any action against these women without my direct order. Is that clear?" The ranch hands exchanged uneasy glances, clearly torn between their loyalty to Montgomery and their distrust of the Comanche sisters. Finally, Harlan nodded reluctantly. "Yes, boss." As the men helped Thomas mount his horse and prepared to depart, Montgomery found himself in the unusual position of standing between his own men and the Comanche women, a mediator in a conflict he hadn't fully understood until now. When the ranch hands had ridden out of sight, he turned back to the sisters. Wahatu had moved to stand beside Titsu, the two presenting a united front. Despite their different reactions to the confrontation, Titsu's measured diplomacy and Wahatu's fierce defensiveness, Montgomery could see now how they complemented each other, how they had likely survived in this changing world by balancing these approaches. "Your man was only wounded because I chose it to be so," Wahatu said, breaking the silence. "I am not careless with my shots." Montgomery believed her. The confidence with which she handled the rifle spoke of considerable skill, and Thomas's wound, a graze rather than a more serious injury, suggested precise intention rather than luck. "Why did you come back to my ranch yesterday?" he asked, addressing both sisters. "You must have known how it would be received." Titsu and Wahatu exchanged a glance. It was Titsu who answered. "Because the old ways no longer work. Hiding, avoiding, retreating. These will not protect what matters anymore. Your world keeps expanding, taking more and more. We decided it was time to speak directly, to look into the eyes of the man who now claims our sacred places." She gestured to the cave behind them, to the creek, and hills beyond, to see if he might listen where others have not. Montgomery studied the sisters, seeing them now not as threats or trespassers, but as women fighting to preserve something precious in the only way left to them. The sun had climbed high in the sky, casting short shadows on the rocky ground. The day's heat was building, but inside the mouth of the cave, the air remained cool and still. Montgomery made a decision. "Come back to the ranch with me," he said. The sisters stiffened, suspicion immediately returning to their postures. He raised a hand. "Not as prisoners, as guests. We need to talk, really talk, about this land and what it means to both of us. And I'd rather do it someplace where there won't be any more misunderstandings." He nodded toward the direction his men had gone, or bullets. Titsu considered him carefully, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. Beside her, Wahatu looked skeptical, her hand still resting on her rifle. "Why should we trust you?" she asked bluntly. Montgomery had no easy answer for this. Trust had to be earned, and the history between their peoples offered little foundation for it. "Because if I meant you harm," he said finally, "I would have let my men take you in. And because I think you're right, there has to be another way forward than more bloodshed." Against all odds, and perhaps against their better judgment, the Comanche sisters agreed to accompany Montgomery back to Ironwood Ranch. They rode side by side across the rolling landscape, an unlikely trio that drew curious and concerned looks from the ranch hands they passed. Montgomery led them not to the main house, but to a shaded arbor near the garden his late wife had planted years ago. It was a peaceful spot, away from the bustle of ranch operations, where wild roses now grew in tangled profusion over a simple wooden frame. A table and benches sat in the dappled shade, offering a place for conversation away from prying eyes and ears. As they dismounted, Montgomery noticed how both women took in every detail of their surroundings, marking escape routes and potential threats with the practiced awareness of those accustomed to danger. He gestured to the arbor. "Please, sit. I'll have some food brought out." Titsu nodded her acceptance, though Wahata remained standing, her posture tense and watchful. The conversation that unfolded over the next several hours was unlike any Montgomery had experienced in his long years on the frontier. Initially stilted and cautious, it gradually opened into a genuine exchange as the sisters shared the history of their family's connection to the land, stories passed down through generations about the caves, the springs, the ancient oak, and the hunting grounds beyond the ridge. They spoke of ceremonies conducted in the cave during key seasonal transitions, of healing plants that grew only in certain protected valleys, of ancestral burial grounds that held the remains of their people, going back centuries. In return, Montgomery shared his own journey, his arrival in Texas after the war, his struggles to establish the ranch, the wife and son he'd buried in the small plot behind the house. He spoke of his own connection to the land, forged through years of working its soil, weathering its storms, and defending its boundaries. Two different worldviews, two different understandings of what it meant to belong to a place. Yet as the conversation continued, points of unexpected resonance emerged. "You care for this land," Titsa observed as the afternoon shadows lengthened. "That much is clear." Montgomery nodded, looking out over the ranch he'd built. "I've put my life into it," he said simply. Wahatsu, who had finally taken a seat, though her wariness hadn't entirely faded, leaned forward. "But do you know it? Do you understand its language?" Before Montgomery could respond, she continued. The way the wind changes before a storm, how the birds fall silent when danger approaches, where the best medicines grow and when to harvest them, which parts of the creek never freeze, even in the coldest winters. Her questions weren't confrontational, but genuinely curious, as if she were trying to gauge the depth of his relationship with the land he claimed to own. Montgomery considered her words. He knew some of these things, certainly. No rancher survived long without developing an intimate knowledge of their environment. But he had to admit there were depths to the sister's understanding that his own didn't match. A knowledge based not just on practical survival needs, but on generations of observation, ritual, and tradition. "I'm willing to learn," he said finally. The simple statement hung in the air between them, an unexpected opening in what had begun as a territorial dispute. Titsu's expression softened slightly. "And we are willing to teach. If you are willing to share." Montgomery raised an eyebrow. "Share?" Titsu nodded. "The caves, the springs, the old oak, the hunting grounds. Allow us access to these places, to continue our ways there without fear of being driven off or worse." She held his gaze steadily. "In return, we will share our knowledge of the land. We will help you understand its language, its rhythms. This knowledge will make your ranch stronger, your cattle healthier, your crops more abundant." It was an offer Montgomery hadn't anticipated. Not a demand for ownership in terms he understood, but a proposal for coexistence and mutual benefit. A recognition that perhaps there was room for both their worldviews to find expression on this contested ground. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though with less conviction than when he'd posed the same question during their first encounter. Wahatu answered this time, her voice carrying the edge that her sisters lacked. "Then the land will continue to resist you, as it did last night with your fences and your cattle. And we will continue to defend what is sacred to us." Her hand moved to rest on the knife at her belt, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. "There are only two of us, yes, but we are not alone. The spirits of our ancestors watch from the old oak. The wisdom of our grandmothers speaks from the cave walls. The strength of our people flows in the springs." Despite himself, Montgomery felt a chill at her words. Not because he believed in the spiritual forces she invoked, but because he recognized the determination behind them. The same unyielding resolve that had allowed the Comanche to resist the encroachment of white settlers for generations before finally being overcome by sheer numbers and superior firepower. A decision lay before Montgomery, one that would define not just the future of his ranch, but his own legacy in this contested land. The practical rancher in him argued for asserting his legal rights, for enforcing the boundaries established by deed and law. The land was his, purchased fairly according to the systems that governed such transactions in the world he inhabited. To compromise this claim might be seen as weakness by his neighbors, might invite further challenges to his authority. But another part of him, the part that had come to respect the land during his years working it, the part that understood that true strength sometimes lay in flexibility rather than rigidity, saw the wisdom in Titsu's proposal. The sacred places the sisters sought to protect represented a tiny fraction of his total holdings. Allowing them access would cost him little in practical terms, while potentially gaining him knowledge that might benefit his ranch in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And beyond these practical considerations lay a deeper question of right and wrong, of justice in a world where justice had too often been determined solely by power. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the ranch yard, Montgomery made his decision. The caves, the springs, the old oak, and the hunting grounds beyond the ridge, he said, echoing Tetsuwa's words. You may come and go freely in these places. No one from my ranch will interfere with your activities there, so long as they don't threaten my operation. He paused, considering the implications of his offer. In return, I would indeed like to learn what you know of this land, its seasons, its medicines, its hidden strengths. And I would ask that we establish some way to communicate regularly to prevent misunderstandings like today's. Tetsuwa's face remained carefully neutral, but Montgomery thought he detected a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Perhaps she hadn't expected him to agree so readily. Beside her, Wahatu's expression was more openly skeptical. Words are easy, she said. How do we know you will honor this agreement when we are gone? It was a fair question. Promises between white settlers and native peoples had a long history of being broken when convenient. I'll draw up papers, Montgomery began, then stopped himself, recognizing the irony of offering written documentation to women who had just challenged the very concept of such records. No, I'll do better than that. I'll ride into town tomorrow and speak with Judge Gardner. He's a fair man. I'll have him record our agreement and make it binding on anyone who might own this land in the future. It wasn't a perfect solution. No legal document could fully capture the spiritual and cultural significance of the places they sought to protect. But it represented Montgomery's genuine attempt to bridge the gap between their worlds. And to show my good faith, he continued, I'll call off the sheriff. Make it clear that you are to be left alone when you're on my land. Tetsu studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. We accept these terms, but understand this, James Montgomery. Our trust is not given lightly, nor all at once. It must be earned day by day, season by season. The following weeks brought an unusual new rhythm to Ironwood Ranch. True to his word, Montgomery had ridden into town and spoken with Judge Gardner, explaining the situation and requesting that their agreement be formally recorded. The judge, a thoughtful man who had spent decades navigating the complex realities of frontier justice, had been skeptical at first, but ultimately understood the practical wisdom of Montgomery's approach. Better to make peace with your neighbors when you can, he had observed. God knows there's been enough blood spilled over these lands already. The document they drew up was unique in the annals of Texas property law, a binding easement that guaranteed the Comanche sisters' right of access to the specified sacred areas, coupled with provisions ensuring these protections would transfer to any future owners of the property. Sheriff Blackwood had been less understanding, viewing the arrangement as a dangerous precedent and a surrender to Indian demands. But Montgomery's standing in the community, combined with the judge's support, was enough to ensure that official interference was kept at bay. True to their word, Tetsu and Wahatu began sharing their knowledge of the land with Montgomery. They showed him plants with medicinal properties that grew in specific locations on his property. Plants that could heal wounds, reduce fevers, or calm a colicky horse. They pointed out subtle signs in nature that preceded weather changes, allowing him to move his herds to safety before storms struck. They revealed hidden springs that could provide water during dry periods when other sources failed. This knowledge, passed down through generations of intimate connection with the land, proved invaluable to ranch operations. Montgomery's cattle thrived, his crops flourished, and his reputation as a successful rancher grew. Some of his neighbors viewed his arrangement with the Comanche sisters with suspicion or outright disapproval. Others, seeing his success, began to wonder if there might be wisdom in his approach. A few even sought similar agreements with native people living near their own properties. Though such arrangements remained rare in a time and place still marked by deep cultural divisions and mistrust. For Titsu and Wahatsu, the agreement meant security and continuity. They continued their seasonal movements, sometimes living in the caves, sometimes traveling to join other Comanche bands for important gatherings or ceremonies. But always they returned to the sacred places on what was now Montgomery's land, maintaining the traditions that connected them to their ancestors and to the land itself. Over time, a cautious trust developed between the rancher and the sisters. Not friendship exactly. The wounds of history ran too deep for that. But a mutual respect, born of keeping their word to each other and finding unexpected value in their unlikely alliance. Montgomery came to appreciate the sisters' fierce independence and deep wisdom, while they recognized in him a willingness to transcend the rigid thinking of his culture that few white men demonstrated. The tension that had marked their early interactions gradually gave way to a comfortable familiarity, punctuated by occasional moments of genuine connection. One evening, nearly a year after their first confrontation, Montgomery sat with Titsu by the creek that ran through his property. The summer heat had finally broken, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak that stood sentinel over the ancestral burial ground. They had been discussing the upcoming cattle drive to the railhead in Kansas, with Titsu offering insights about water sources along the route that had been known to her people for generations. As their conversation drifted into a comfortable silence, Montgomery found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "When you first rode onto my ranch," he said finally, "did you expect this outcome?" Titsu's lips curved in a slight smile, the expression transforming her usually serious face. "I hoped for it," she admitted, "but I did not expect it. Most white men see only what they want to see, hear only what they want to hear." She looked at him directly. "You surprised me, James Montgomery. You were willing to listen." Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. "And you surprised me. You could have chosen conflict, like your sister was ready to do. Instead, you offered another path." He glanced toward the ranch house in the distance, where lights were beginning to glow in the windows as night approached. "I've been thinking lately about what it means to own something. All my life, I've believed that ownership meant having papers with your name on them, having the right to use the land as you see fit, to keep others off if you choose." He picked up a smooth stone from the creek bank, turning it over in his weathered hands. "But this past year has taught me there are deeper ways to belong to a place, ways that can't be captured in deeds or maps." Titsu nodded, her gaze following the flow of the creek. "My people do not believe that humans can own the earth, any more than they can own the sky or the wind. We belong to the land, not the other way around. We are its caretakers, not its masters." The philosophy was still foreign to Montgomery's Western thinking. Yet he found himself increasingly able to appreciate its wisdom. The land would remain long after all of them were gone. Montgomery with his legal deeds, Titsu and Wahatu with their ancestral connections, all the ranchers and settlers and native peoples who had come before and would come after. What mattered, perhaps, was not who owned the land in any given moment, but how they treated it during their brief stewardship. "I still believe in property rights," Montgomery said with a small smile. "Some things don't change, but I also believe now that the land has its own rights, its own voice, and those who listen to it are the ones who truly prosper here." Tetsu studied him, her expression thoughtful. "You are learning, James Montgomery. Slower than Wahatu would like, perhaps, but learning nonetheless." The comment held a warmth that would have been unthinkable during their first tense encounters. As they parted that evening, Montgomery to return to his ranch house, Tetsuo to join her sister at their current camp by the caves, both carried with them a sense of having discovered something rare and valuable in their unlikely alliance. Not just practical benefits, though these had been substantial for both parties, but a model of coexistence that challenged the prevailing wisdom of their time. Two worlds, two worldviews, finding a way to share the same physical space without requiring the destruction or surrender of either. It wasn't perfect. Tensions still arose occasionally. Misunderstandings still occurred. But it offered a glimpse of a different possible future for the contested lands of the American frontier. Years later, when asked about the unusual arrangement he had made with the Comanche sisters, Montgomery would simply say, "They taught me that some hearts are too wild to be tamed, and that's as it should be. The land needs its wild hearts, just as it needs those who would build fences and raise barns. There's room enough for both if we're wise enough to see it." If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.